Good morning. I'm Myrtis Fossey, Deputy Leader of the Canadian Party of Quebec. Alongside me is Colin Standish, Leader of the party, and Will Toland, a former candidate. The Canadian Party of Quebec is a provincial political party in Quebec that was founded in June 2022 and is proud to present a principled, progressive, and federalist vision of the future of Quebec and Canada. The onset of the new year brings with it a time of reflection and evaluation of the year preceding, a post-game analysis of sorts, wherein both successes and defeats are accounted for and course corrections are made where needed. It is in this spirit that I reflect upon the leadership of Canada in 2023 and aspire to make some recommendations for improvements in federal and provincial leadership. High-quality leaders and leadership, whether in business, personal relationships, or politics, requires the ability to know the 3 Ps: promote, protect, punish. Whom, when, and what to promote. What does the future look like? What is holding things back and preventing growth? What, whom, and when to protect. Where are blind spots? What supports are needed? What, whom, and when to punish. Where is discipline needed, accountability, restitution, resolution, and prevention called for? When I look back on what is happening in Quebec, it is clear that good leadership is lacking, despite very real concerns around healthcare, education, housing, and the economy. The CAQ remain French-obsessed. All resources are focalized around divisive, punitive linguistic laws. They have shown no diversity in the 3 Ps. They promote only French, they protect only French, and they punish only English. As though this weren't enough, the Canadian federal government either stands by mutely and allows the situation to deteriorate without making use of its legal power to uphold the Constitution. Worse, it fans the flame and further panders to the Francophone zealots by the passing of detrimental laws such as Bill C-13. And all this despite repeated calls to action from the Canadian Party of Quebec. Stop the madness, lead the country. I wonder, how is it possible when there is a shortage of teachers and the Canadian Charter of Rights clearly stipulates the right to religion, the CAQ government enforces a law that prohibits a female teacher wearing a headscarf when teaching in a public school? How is it possible that when emergency rooms are at 200% capacity, the CAQ government withdraws funding to English educational establishments on the eve of the grand opening of a post-secondary nursing program? How is it possible that when the Charter of Rights clearly stipulates that Canada has 2 official languages, Quebec medical practitioners can refuse to provide services in English to Anglophone citizens? How is it possible that Quebec judges, the ones called upon to make decisions about the fate of both Anglophones and Francophones, they're not required to know both official languages? How is it possible that after a lifetime of contributing to the Canadian economy, after a lifetime of paying federal and provincial taxes, an Anglophone widow in Quebec cannot get a copy of her husband's death certificate in English? How is it possible that when the Canadian Charter of Rights specifically protects against unlawful search and seizure of confidential information, the OQLF can, when investigating a linguistic complaint, seize personal effects, confidential files, without a warrant? How is it possible that as the economy languishes and Canada still sends massive transfer payments to Quebec, the CAQ spends money on promoting French instead of health, education, and housing? How is it possible that as educational attainment and international market performance of Canadian students and youth plummet, the CAQ mandates additional French language courses and attainments to the detriment of core curriculum courses and credits in post-secondary education? How is it possible that in a country with 2 official languages, out-of-province students who are nonetheless Canadian citizens are penalized for wanting to attend English universities in Quebec? How is it possible that in a country that prides itself on diversity and equity, basic linguistic access rights are not guaranteed in English to Quebec residents? How is it possible that in a country with 2 official languages, only French is treated as a minority language to be protected, but English is not protected in Quebec, despite being a minority official language? Like a spoilt toddler at a birthday party, the CAQ becomes petulant when reminded that the cake is for everyone to share and that they are not entitled to a larger piece than anyone else just because they're kicking up a fuss. Unfortunately, much like the overwhelmed parent in this scenario, the Canadian federal government is wringing its hands and pleading uselessly with a spoilt child to be reasonable now, as the child blusters and storms about deserving a bigger piece of cake. Where is federal leadership? Why isn't the federal government disallowing unconstitutional laws from being passed? Why isn't the federal government requiring accountability and limiting chronic and preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause to pass laws that are in deliberate breach of the Charter of Rights? Why isn't the federal government withholding transfer funds pending proof of fiscal responsibility? Why isn't the federal government withholding transfer fund when charter rights are not being respected? The federal government could promote bilingualism throughout the provinces instead of promoting distinct status capriciously on some and not others. The federal government could protect English and French access rights in education, health, and law throughout the country, without exception, regardless of minority or majority status. The federal government could provide recourse for linguistically alienated and abused citizens. They could create an ombudsman for bilingual access rights to all Canadian citizens. Local, provincial groups would be tasked with investigating complaints, ensuring compliance and fiscal or financial responsibility for the use of transfer funds. Quebec is not a nation in its own right. It is a province of Canada, and it should be treated like one. Its citizens deserve protection and a government with a vision. Au Québec, on parle français, mais on parle anglais aussi, tout comme le reste du Canada. Merci. Thank you. I now present the Canadian Party of Quebec leader, Colin Standish.
Thank you, Myrtis, for those remarks. Once again, my name is Colin Standish, leader of the Canadian Party of Quebec. Canada in 2024 is on a precipice. If I were to sum up the current state of our federation, it feels like the ball of wax is melting. As if the drips of molten wax only temporarily make the flames flicker, and the flames only seem to burn stronger and more brightly. We Canadians, like the clever magic trick shown to me as a child around the dinner table, we can pinch the flame without getting burned if we choose to. Who will speak and act for a united Canada and the rights of all Canadians? The federal government has a moral, fiduciary, financial, legal, and constitutional responsibility to uphold the Constitution, basic human and civil rights for all Quebecers and Canadians, and to maintain a united country. The time is now for the Canadian government, which wields a financial and legal authority to do so, and the Liberal Party of Canada to step up to the plate and defend the Canadian Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the sacred ideal that all Canadians should be equal in their treatment before the law. Recent articles in the national press summarize the situation succinctly. As John Edmondson wrote recently, Mr. Trudeau has put the Federation under greater threat of schism than any time since the 1995 Quebec referendum on sovereignty. Andrew Coyne also wrote, most federal governments, it is true, have preferred the quiet life, which is why the Federation is in such a comically dilapidated state, a patchwork of asymmetric arrangements with no common market or increasingly common rights as citizens. The governments of Quebec, Alberta, and Saskatchewan are in open rebellion against the federal government, the rule of law, and the spirit and letter of the Constitution. Basic rights to government services are being ignored. Rights of the individual, thought to be relatively sacrosanct under the Canadian Charter and our democratic system, have been under assault. In Quebec, which has led the charge in violations of former sacrosanct rights and institutions, the law is known as Bill 40, which eliminated all school boards in the province, Bill 21, which seeks to coerce so-called secularism by discriminating against minorities in public sector employment, Bill 96, which seeks to promote, allegedly, the French language through regressive restrictions on individuals and businesses and restructures the entirety of our society and our country. And now Bill 15, which centralizes all health and social services, will likely lead to worse healthcare outcomes, strips away local oversight and authority, and potentially revokes the status of centuries-old bilingual institutions founded by the English-speaking community, which now serve all Quebecers in all languages and of all backgrounds. Bill 96 seizes federal jurisdictions for labor law, trademarks, and purports to modify the Constitution Act of 1867, with new articles proclaiming Quebec a nation territorially and ethnically in a binary constitutional document which only recognizes provinces and the federal government. We reiterate our past statements that references Bill 96 to be removed from the new Official Languages Act known as Bill C-13. The use of the notwithstanding clause is of concern for all Canadians, where basic rights can be set aside by simple mention of Section 33 in a piece of ordinary legislation by provincial or federal governments. The old logic that political consequences were too dire for politicians to use them has fallen to the wayside as the federal government has refused to act. Saskatchewan, to much less public scrutiny than what has transpired in Quebec, has passed the Saskatchewan First Act, which amends unilaterally the Saskatchewan Act and the Constitution Act of 1867. The amendments to both these acts proclaim the autonomy of Saskatchewan and it's inserted into a document which is part of the Canadian Constitution and can only be modified according to the Constitution's own words, in accordance with the authority contained in the Constitution of Canada. Who has spoken out against this in Saskatchewan or the rest of Canada or in the federal parliament? Saskatchewan has also invoked the notwithstanding clause in refusing to remit carbon taxes deemed lawful by the Supreme Court of Canada. Alberta has saber-rattled the end of CPP, the Canadian Pension Plan, and not to enforce federal laws on its territory, should it choose to. The Alberta Sovereignty Act has proclaimed Alberta is not subordinate to the Government of Canada. It has sovereign provincial rights and powers, and that a conflict or inconsistency gives predominance to provincial legislation. This is, of course, legal absurdity, where federal predominance is a cornerstone of constitutional law in Canada. And today we want to be specific about federal powers, the Constitution, and health. The logic of convenience applied by the Prime Minister, Cabinet Ministers, Members of Parliament, and the government in Canada has been that provinces are free to act within their jurisdiction. While this is somewhat a tautological truism, our federation allows for the blending of powers and federal predominance where conflicts exist. As well, the federal government retains the powers of disallowance and reservation to stop unconstitutional provincial laws before they are officially passed. Additionally, the federal government retains much power of the purse and can ensure compliance with universal Canadian laws, regulations, and rights. Today, we are formally requesting the Minister of Health, the Honourable Mark Holland, use his powers to ensure all Quebecers can access healthcare in the official language of their choice, and for Indigenous Quebecers and for newcomers to have access to healthcare in their native languages through translation services where and if required. The 5 criteria of the Canada Health Act are as such as follows: public administration, comprehensiveness, universality, portability, and accessibility. The notable aspects of this act we highlight today are universality and accessibility. Compliance and enforcement in the Act itself is as follows. If the federal minister is of the opinion that a province or territory's healthcare insurance plan does not meet one of these criteria, or that the territory or province does not meet the conditions necessary for receiving the Canada Health Transfer, can direct any cash contribution to that province for a fiscal year be reduced in respect of each default by the amount that the Governor and Council considers to be appropriate, or having regard to the gravity of the default, or where the Governor and Council considers it appropriate, direct that the whole of any cash contribution that, to that province for a fiscal year be withheld. This means the federal cabinet has the power to take a stand on what is happening in Quebec, where Bill 15 and Bill 96 might extinguish the ability for citizens, over 1 million citizens, to access basic health and social services. They have the power. The Canadian Party of Quebec, in line with its publicly stated action plan against Bill 96, demands that all Quebecers, including self-defined English speakers, be treated in health and social services settings in the Canadian official language that they are most comfortable in and understand best. Bill 96 and Bill 15 provide unnecessary constraints on the ability of healthcare practitioners and providers to provide services in the language that best serves their patient. Proper and effective communication is a key determinant of healthcare outcomes. We want to ensure that certain core public services, health and social services, where language is a key component in ensuring a successful clinical intervention, are offered in English for all persons who are most comfortable to receive these services throughout Quebec. That newcomers appropriately be given service in the language of their choice, and Indigenous Canadians be provided the service in their native or preferred official language. The moral and intellectual cowardice in defending a country for which over 119,000 Canadians have perished in conflicts since Confederation, has become a defining characteristic of our political elite across all partisan lines. We call on the Government of Canada and all parliamentarians to unite in defending the idea that Canada is not a collection of separate communities, tethered together by some antiquated notion of history, but a nation of principles, freedoms, and compassion. Thank you. Any questions?
There's no question in the room or online, so that will conclude the press conference. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.